It was here at the Pentagon that the Defense Department first became interested in the UFO phenomenon. This occurred in the late 1940s, with reports about objects and lights seen in the sky by military personnel and others. The Air Force decided to investigate the matter anyway. There was that one possibility that these flying objects could well be foreign weapons used for test purposes and might affect our national security. The investigative branch was called Project Sign. The project had only been underway for about 2 weeks when the Mantell crash had made headlines across the nation. The staff's investigation was far from complete, but public pressure was enormous. And they were forced to come up with an answer to really quiet growing speculation that Mantell had been killed by hostile aliens in some flying saucer. That's when we decided that Mantell had chased the planet Venus. However, this was an initial finding. The Chills and Whitted case had an impact on the Air Force project. It presented the first close-up account by highly reliable witnesses. The object described led some of the staff to postulate an extraterrestrial theory. And they wrote up an estimate of the situation, which at the time was classified top secret, suggesting that the saucers were from outer space. This theory was rejected by the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Hoyt Vandenberg, and even other Project Sign staff members as not having enough proof. So the extraterrestrial visitation idea was dropped for the time being.
In 1948, 3 separate UFO sightings that have come to be known as the classics sparked the modern UFO investigation movement. In response to public demand for answers, the U.S. government established Project Sign. Its stated purpose was to scientifically investigate UFO sightings, and among its first commissions was one of the 3 classic cases, the mysterious death of pilot Thomas Mantell. Was the World War II flying ace the world's first UFO fatality?
Tommy was my big brother. He was 3 years older than I. And sort of awesome to me, of course. I remember Tommy mostly interested in airplanes. He made model airplanes and he had them hanging all over his bed.
He wanted to be a fighter pilot so bad, but he was too tall. But then he was very happy when they sent him over to England, and his job was to take the gliders and paratroopers behind the lines. And on D-Day, that's what he did.
On June 6, 1944, Thomas Mantell proved just what kind of a pilot he was. Mantell's top-secret mission was to deliver a glider deep behind enemy lines. Towing the glider behind his unarmed C-24, Mantell came under attack from enemy anti-aircraft fire 100 miles from the drop-off point. The plane was hit, but Mantell kept going and completed his mission, dropping the glider on target. This is what his plane looked like when it landed safely in England. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism and extraordinary achievement in aerial flight.
When he got out of the Army, I was hoping he'd get a regular 9-to-5 job, but he still wanted airplanes, so he started his own flying school. Then he joined the Air National Guards, and he liked that because he got to fly fighter planes in the Air National Guard.
On January 7th, 1948, 6 months after receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross, Captain Mantell died during what should have been a routine training mission.
He and his flight were retrieving some aircraft that had been undergoing overhaul and maintenance down in Marietta, Georgia.
Larry Tabor is an historian and aeronautics expert who's been researching the Mantell case for more than 10 years.
When I got into college, I found out that our squadron at the University of Louisville was named after Thomas Mantell, the Arnold Air Society portion of it. And so I began to do more and more research.
Tabor has amassed hundreds of civilian and military documents related to the curious death of Thomas Mantell.
He was returning from Marietta, Georgia that day with 3 other men in a flight of P-51 fighters. And they were returning to Stanford Field when they received a call from Godman Tire at Fort Knox to pursue an unidentified flying object that had been in the area. One of the airplanes did not participate in the flight because it was short of fuel. The other 3 aircraft continued on, even though 2 of the aircraft, including Mantell's, were not equipped to go at high altitudes. They did see some type of flying object. They chased it for a certain amount of time there in the early afternoon, and they got to about 25,000 feet, and at that point, Mantell's wingman turned back to escort the less experienced pilot down. I, of course, find that strange, since it's the job of a wingman to stay with his flight leader at all time. Mantell chose to continue to chase the object, something that he felt was a threat to the security of America. At some point, Mantell said, "I see the object, I'm going to pursue it a little bit further." And that was the last contact that anybody had with Mantell. He went up to above 33,000, and at that point appears to have died from anoxia or lack of oxygen. The aircraft was continuing its high-power climb. Of course, with Mantell dead, eventually the aircraft heeled over from torque and came down in a spin, where it crashed in a field down in Franklin, Kentucky.
We were not told or informed by the Air Force. They wanted to sweep it under the rug with as little attention to themselves as possible, whether it be because they felt they were at fault for sending him, or if it was something they didn't want to talk about, what he was chasing. A neighbor that lived 3 houses down came to our house and told my mother what had happened.
2 neighbors from down the street came in, and they said, "Peggy, we got something we've got to tell you." And of course, I had no idea what it was. And they told me, they said, "Tommy's had a crash." And I said, "Oh, is he all right?" And they said, "No, he was killed."
The main thing I recall was standing in my brother's home with his wife, and we were all standing in a circle, holding hands, and my mother said, "The circle's broken." And I might say she was broken also.
For nearly 50 years, the family of Thomas Mantell has searched for an explanation. The military's silence has contributed to a flood of contradictory rumors. Mantell's body was found riddled with bullets. The body was missing. The plane had disintegrated. The wreckage was radioactive. And most disturbing of all, that Thomas Mantell's P-51 was knocked down by an extraterrestrial spacecraft. When we come back, our sightings investigative team returns to the crash site. Remarkably, after nearly 50 years and a thorough military investigation, sightings was still able to find additional pieces of wreckage from Thomas Mantell's P-51. National Guard pilot Thomas Mantell, on a routine training mission, spotted what he believed was a UFO bearing down on him. Moments later, his plane crashed, and from that day to this, his family has never known why.
They've always had the theory. I still hear the Venus theory, and most recently the balloon theory, the top secret balloon that was out at that time.
The Air Force will neither confirm nor deny the existence of a balloon near Godman Field that day. But there is compelling evidence that such a balloon did exist. In the hours before Mantell's UFO sightings and subsequent death, several bases reported seeing a UFO overhead, traveling at 250 miles per hour. One air controller described it as round and white, resembling a parachute.
The Navy Skyhook balloon program was aimed at carrying cosmic ray experiments into the stratosphere, and the January 6, 1948 flight carried instruments, I believe, for the University of Minnesota Physics Department.
Chief Engineer Charles Moore believes that the Skyhook balloon, launched on January 6th, was directly responsible for Thomas Mantell's death on January 7th.
We heard reports of a large white object being seen in the sky over Illinois, and later we heard reports of a similar object being seen over Kentucky, and this was the first time that anyone in the central United States had ever seen such a high-flying balloon.
But there are serious discrepancies between the actual flight pattern of a Skyhook balloon and what Thomas Mantell reported seeing. He described an object traveling up and forward as fast as he was, and that the UFO was metallic and of tremendous size.
I do believe, and I always will, that it was a cover-up because they never came to talk to anybody in my family about what had happened. They more or less just let us assume what had happened on our own.
I'm very angry sometimes as the Air Force. I feel like they know more than they're telling us. It's affected my children because they never knew their daddy growing up. They were just children.
I feel that he was intelligent and experienced enough not to have made the mistake of chasing a balloon. On several occasions, he said he couldn't gain on the object. It even appeared to be going faster than he was.
I think it's possible that Captain Mantell did see the balloon and attempt to chase it. I would suspect it would have been high above him so that he had no possibility whatsoever of climbing to the altitude where the balloon was floating, still in the stratosphere.
When I first started doing research many years ago, one of the things that I heard was the fact that the aircraft had small holes in it. It was ionized, and it came about because Captain Mantell had gotten close enough to the exhaust system of whatever type of flying object that it was, and when this UFO kicked into high gear to leave our orbit, he was caught in the exhaust blast.
If Captain Mantell had been caught in a radioactive backwash, the wreckage of his plane would tell the story best. Sightings sent an investigative team to the crash site in Franklin, Kentucky, with the hope that clues to the Mantell mystery might still litter this field. It was the first time the family had been to the crash site.
At the time of the accident, we were not able to come here. They threw security all in the whole area.
Glenn and Anna Margaret Mays were two of the first people on the scene.
I mean, it was like pandemonium, you know, how people just congregating, and it was, you know, the road was full of cars and people were coming.
Mm-hmm. How long did they keep the area blocked off for?
Good while, didn't they, Glenn?
Okay.
Pretty good while.
I don't know exactly how long.
On 2 or 3 days, they brought a truck and a dozer down here from Fort Knox and loaded what was left of the plane on a truck and took a dozer and buried, you know.
Right.
That's what we heard. We just heard that information today. Yeah, we heard that.
After 46 years, Glenn Mays thought he remembered the location where the military had buried wreckage from Mantell's plane. After so many years, our team had few expectations, but the family had high hopes.
Right up in there, bunch of weeds right in there. It's pretty close. Right up in there where them weeds are.
Well, I'm getting some radiation spikes.
There were pockets of high radiation in the field, but when our team began to dig, there were no signs of metal debris.
I sent him back to fetch a picture he has showing where the aircraft crashed. If that can give us perhaps a better determination of how far it is from the barn and if the military's records are accurate or not.
Our sightings camera crew matched the angle and the depth of field shown in this old newspaper clipping. It may not have been the most technically sophisticated method the team tried, but it worked.
Yep. Aircraft.
It's green, isn't it?
Yeah, it's chromate green. That's the interior of the aircraft. That's one of the spars. There you go. It's not necessarily all over. It's just like on sections. That's interesting. See? Here it'll spike, but up here it goes back to normal.
In just the few remaining hours of daylight, Larry Tabor and the sightings team found over 24 pieces of wreckage.
Fortunately, there are serial numbers on several pieces of the aircraft that were recovered, and these can be traced to ensure that it did come from the airplane that Captain Mantell was flying that day.
I hope what you all are doing brings to light some of it, because I was hoping before I pass on that I find out what it is.
If this is wreckage from Mantell's plane, why was it buried in an unmarked trench by the same military that had promised to do a thorough investigation? And why does it refuse to answer the Mantell family's simple plea? What happened to Tommy?
As far as a military cover-up, I believe there was, at that time, very much a cover-up of the whole incident.
To me, that's why there's always been a question. Maybe it was a UFO. How do we know?
He was too good of a pilot to take a risk of his life and to hurt his family, to go chasing after something that wasn't there.
On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Captain Thomas Mantell Jr. proved just what kind of a pilot he was. He received the Silver Star and Flying Cross for heroism and extraordinary achievement in flight after he successfully towed a spy glider across enemy lines. After the war, he opened up his own flight school and served in the Kentucky Air National Guard. He was a devoted husband, a loving father, and the first confirmed casualty of a military UFO confrontation. The identity of that UFO has never been revealed, and the family that Tommy Mantell left behind still have nagging questions that prolong their grief.
The Air Force has been absolutely no help at all. They have told us absolutely nothing. They sent nobody out to talk to my mother when this happened. It may have been 48 years ago, but not knowing still hurts.
The day Tommy died, January 7th, 1948, the air traffic controller at Godman Field was Quentin Blackwell, the man who heard Captain Mantell's last words. Now, after 48 years, Tommy's sister Betty and his two sons, Terry and Thomas III, are going to meet Quentin Blackwell for the first time.
It's been almost 50 years since your father was killed. What are you hoping that Quentin Blackwell will tell you?
Just to hear the last, what he said in his last words, since he was the last person to talk to my dad.
What I hope Mr. Blackwell will clear up in my mind is if Mr. Blackwell happened to see the object that he was pursuing, or if he could shed any light on what it was.
All along, due to the cover-up, I felt like either they knew what it was and didn't want to tell us, or they didn't know what it was and they didn't want the world to know. And I would kind of like to know which of those things maybe it was.
Blackwell has never spoken publicly about the incident, but nearly 50 years later, he's still troubled by his memories. It was his son, Jackie, who convinced Blackwell to break the Air Force-imposed gag order after seeing the Mantells on sightings.
To me, it was a family's appeal. They asked for anybody that had any information surrounding this incident, if they could talk to the families, and to me, that was enough, and I just had to talk to my dad and say, look, do you want to? And Dad says, yeah, I'll talk to the family.
On January 7th, 1948, Mantell was part of a team ferrying P-51 fighters from Georgia to his home base in Kentucky. Near Godman Field, Fort Knox, the tower asked the team to investigate reports of a strange, unidentified flying object. The planes were not equipped for high altitude, and all but Tommy turned back at 25,000 feet. Tommy pursued the UFO and described a large metallic object. At 33,000 feet, his plane heeled over and came down in a spin. It crashed and burned in a Kentucky field. The Air Force said Tommy blacked out from lack of oxygen while mistakenly chasing an experimental balloon. But in Tulsa, at Quentin Blackwell's home, the Mantells heard a much different story from a key eyewitness.
I got to the tower and I looked out there and there was that saucer. Boy. So I called the base operations officer from downstairs, a major, and he came up. He said, you got me in trouble now. I've got to call the base commander. So he called over to Fort Knox and have some of the generals come over.
During our conversation, Blackwell confirmed many of the family's suspicions and also provided new information about the real reason why the other P-51s decided to turn back.
Abruptly, he said, Godman Tower, my two wingmen are coming in. We want hot guns, and we want them now.
Hot guns is Air Force slang for loading live ammunition into aircraft artillery. A National Guard wing commander like Mantell could only order weapons to be loaded when there's a verifiable threat and with permission from his superiors. So if Mantell instructed his wingman to load his guns, then someone else had to have seen the threat also.
How did he describe the object?
He said it was about 200 feet across, probably 70, 75 feet thick. It has observation windows in the top section around. He moved around it again and he said it's metallic, dull aluminum color. And he said, well, now it's trying to move away. I'm gonna close in for a better look. And that's the last thing he ever said.
The Air Force speculated that Mantell was suffering hallucinations caused by anoxia, the medical term for lack of oxygen.
Was Captain Mantell coherent when he was talking to you?
In my opinion, he had control right on through. I have worked people with anoxia, and in my opinion, he wasn't suffering. He was in full command of his facility.
Perhaps the most important information Blackwell revealed were the names and ranks of other eyewitnesses in the tower.
Oh, mercy. There was about 3 generals, colonels carrying coffee, the base commander, Colonel Hicks, and the operations officer. It was jammed. When they said he was down, everybody abruptly left because the red tape gets awful. They didn't want to write all the reports, and didn't want to say they'd seen a saucer, didn't want to say they hadn't seen a saucer.
He was definitely chasing something that he felt was of a national...
Well, I think it more or less makes him a hero.
Quentin Blackwell's revelations were a double-edged sword for the family who had traveled so far to meet him. He confirmed their worst fears, that the Air Force knew that Tommy was after more than a balloon and still chose to remain silent. But Blackwell also spoke out about Mantell's heroism, something his family had always known in their hearts.
No one's ever going to convince me I didn't see it, because there were too many of us that did.
At that time, it was general procedure that nobody talk about UFOs.
On January 7th, 1948, high above the bluegrass pastures of rural Kentucky, National Guard Captain Thomas Mantell Jr. saw a UFO that he considered to be a serious threat to the security of the United States. Tower controllers at Godman Field, Fort Knox, saw it too and allowed Mantell to pursue the UFO. A decorated war hero, he had survived anti-aircraft fire in World War II, but Tommy Mantell would not return from this encounter. According to the original Air Force investigation of the crash, Mantell died not in pursuit of a UFO, but while mistakenly chasing the planet Venus. But now, nearly 50 years later, eyewitnesses to Mantell's death are speaking out publicly for the first time, and they have a very different story to tell.
They described the object as being very large, metallic, round metallic object.
Pilot Herb Kipp distinctly remembers hearing the term UFO to describe the object that would take Mantell's life.
In 1948, I was a control tower operator at Stanford Field. We got a phone call from Godman Tower, and he asked if we had any P-51s in the area, and I said, "Why, what's the problem?" He said, "We have a UFO hovering over our airport." And I thought somebody was playing a joke on me or something, and I kind of snickered a little bit. And this other voice came on and said, "This is Colonel so-and-so, and I'm the base commander. And Mr. Kipp, this is no drill. This thing is hovering right over the airport."
Along with the base commander in the tower at Godman Field that day was Base Intelligence Officer Captain James Dusler.
The UFO was in the air for 4 hours, and it didn't move, it just stayed there. We were looking at something and didn't know what in the world we were looking at.
At the time of the sighting, Captain Mantell was leading a squadron of P-51s for the Kentucky National Guard. Over Godman Field, there was no longer anything routine about this mission.
Mantell was requested to pursue this unidentified flying object.
A retired Air Force Reserve captain, Tabor has researched the Mantell case for 15 years.
One of the pilots in the flight, Al Clements, said to him, "Tommy, you don't have any air, you can't do this." Mantell replied back, "Al, don't worry about it, it's not a problem." They continue on up. Clements finally caught onto it himself. He described it as a large, glowing object.
He said, "My 2 wingmen are coming in. We want hot guns, and we want them now."
According to Air Traffic Controller Quentin Blackwell, Mantell ordered the other planes back to to load on live ammunition while he continued to climb toward the UFO. Only this man is still alive to describe what happened next. He is telling his story for the first time since 1948.
The day of the Mantell crash, I was 6 years old. My mother was taking clothes in off the line. She'd been watching a bright light in the sky. We heard a loud plane, and we saw this fighter plane coming in below the bright light. Got pretty close to it, and all of a sudden it went straight up at it. And then when he got all the way to it, he leveled off and flew away from it to the west.
Mantell's plane smashed into the ground, going in excess of Mach 1. Captain Dusler was among the first investigators on the scene. As a seasoned intelligence officer, Dusler had been at many crash sites before, but this one was extraordinary and deeply disturbing.
There wasn't a drop of blood anyplace. Now, I talked to one of the coroner people. It was odd because there was no blood. Odd because there was no fire. I don't ever recall seeing a crash like that, or as serious as that didn't have a fire. I never saw his body because the coroner had taken it away.
No one at the funeral home saw the body. It was in a black leather bag, and then it was sealed inside a lead coffin. The body was buried on the 10th of January, 1948, 3 days after the accident. Certainly a closed coffin funeral. But again, we have a question. Was there even a body in that black leather bag? No one saw the remains.
Despite official denials, there is ample evidence that the Air Force sent a special UFO investigative team from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio to the Mantell crash site. Sightings has obtained memos indicating that Colonel H.M. McCoy, Chief of Air Force Intelligence at Wright-Pat, and his investigator, Al Loading, were attempting to gather information on the flying disc Mantell was chasing. One memo contains a transcription of Loading's request for information about Captain Dusler.
He was the only man assigned to, as he called it, Saucer Project. He had file case after file case after file case filled with reports.
One of the keys to solving this case comes from finding out more information about the Air Force intelligence team that was sent to investigate this incident. Who is Mr./Dr. Loading?
One of the intriguing operatives in the early Project Sign, which had to do with UFO investigations, was a civilian engineer employed at Wright-Patterson named Alfred Ludding. Alfred Ludding was originally part of T3 engineering design, but he was assigned very early in the game, in July of 1947, to work on flying discs for the intelligence group.
Michael Swords is a natural sciences professor at Western Michigan University and is the editor of the highly regarded Journal of UFO Studies. He has uncovered an intriguing link between Wright-Patterson, the mysterious Mr. Loading, and real-life flying saucers.
Al Ludding, for reasons that we don't know, early in July of 1947, designed a flying disc-shaped craft, which, although he was not allowed to patent it at that time, ultimately got a patent for in the early 1950s.
In 1952, Alfred C. Loading was granted a U.S. patent for this low aspect ratio aircraft design. The craft's flying saucer shape raises many intriguing questions. Was Loading's design a flight of fancy? Or was he inspired by something he had actually seen during his tenure in Air Force intelligence?
If we can answer these questions, if we can find out their background, then we can have a little bit more information that could answer as to whether this was an extraterrestrial vehicle.
But the solution to the Mantell mystery is unlikely to come from the one source that probably knows the truth. The Air Force explanation that Mantell died from anoxia, lack of oxygen, while chasing Venus, is contradicted even in their earlier report, recently obtained by Sightings. In this memo, written just after the crash and dated a decade earlier than the official report, Venus is ruled out as the UFO Mantell died for in the sky above his Kentucky home.